Good morning. Welcome, everyone. I am Somini Sengupta. I'm a journalist with the New York Times. I have the good fortune of covering that little existential threat called climate change. But very briefly, I covered Silicon Valley back when Facebook was first going public, and we were trying to explain to our readers what sponsored stories were, if you recall, back in those ancient times. Those of you who are regulars to Davos know that thank you, that there are some fairly comfortable conversations that take place here about the role of technology in our lives and how central big data is to making business competitive in this day and age. We have the good fortune of being led in a discussion today by two thinkers who will guide us in a discussion on the less comfortable truths about data in our lives and technology in our lives, in our personal lives, in our social lives, in our political lives. So I am very, very pleased to have on the stage with us Yuval Harari. You're a historian by training and the author of several wildly, enviably popular books, the most recent of which really touches quite squarely on the role of technology in our lives. Tristan Harris, you're a computer scientist by training, worked as a design ethicist at Google for several years before going on to co-found the Center for Humane Technology. So welcome both of you. Tristan, you told my colleague Nellie Bowles in 2018 that you just couldn't get over how popular Yuval was in Silicon Valley. They just never got tired of listening to him, even though he paints a rather apocalyptic vision of their power. You said, quote, "It's insane, he's so popular. They're all inviting him to campus." You know, the same could be said of the world at Davos. The global titans who are here do really want to hear from you. I think you're doing 3 or 4 sessions. Yesterday's on AI was packed. Today's, I'm happy to see, is very full. I'd like to hear from you why you think your message so resonates. Is there some part of that message, you know, about the tech world's hacking of humanity, as you put it, about rendering millions of people into a useless class in an automated economy? Is there some part of that message that they actually like to hear?
Well, I think that it's partly, yes, it's partly kind of self-flattery that we are the most important people in history. What we are doing, I mean, Genghis Khan is nothing compared to what we are doing. I mean, Genghis Khan, okay, so he built an empire or something, but he didn't change humanity. Same humans before Genghis and after Genghis. But it won't be the same humans before Larry and Mark and after Larry and Mark. So, you know, millions of years in the future, they look back, nobody will remember Genghis, they would remember us. We are a kind of the zero ground of the new evolution. So this is the flattery side. The other side, I think, is that many of them are really concerned. They're naive utopias of we'll just make the world a better place. They now realize it's not as easy as that. We've missed something about human society, about history, about philosophy. They know they have tremendous power and they feel the pressure of responsibility mounting. And I think many of them are really worried and are willing to some extent to listen to new opinions coming from philosophers, from historians. What they'll do with it is a different question, especially if it demands changing their business model. But the basic willingness to hear and the feeling of responsibility, I think it's there.
How do you know that they're worried? Is there an anecdote that you can share?
An anecdote? I mean, do you know an anecdote about that?
Either of you. You know, that persuades you that perhaps there's been a tipping point, that they recognize that it's not so easy, this belief that they're just making the world more connected and a better place.
I think the 2016 elections was a shock for Silicon Valley. And you hear from the way they talk, I mean, adopting ideas, I mean, also from, time well spent, suddenly it pops up in their own visions and discussions. So I think, yes, there is this combination of almost megalomania about the immense power we have, and the fear and humbleness of realizing, hey, we are not so sure what to do with this power. Because again, the very naive utopias, oh, you just need to connect all the world together, or you just need to make information accessible and everything will be wonderful. They realize by now it's not so easy with humans. Humans are more complicated than that. Yes, you connect a lot of people together, so the truth can travel much more easily, but also lies and fictions can travel much more easily. And I think one of the most naive beliefs, not only in Silicon Valley, but all over the world for centuries, is that in the battle of ideas, truth will eventually overcome lies and fiction. And from a historical perspective, it's just not the case. Human power doesn't come from truth, human power comes from cooperation. And it's often much easier to get people to cooperate by making them believe in a fictional story than by making them believe in a truth. E equals MC square is not a winning slogan in any election campaign or in any, I don't know, we try to spread a new religion. So I think that they are realizing that.
This is a perfect segue into what I wanted to ask you, Tristan, about the spread of political disinformation. I think we know now, there is some very compelling research that shows political disinformation spreads really fast, really wide. We've also seen that play out in the real world, from Myanmar to India to Brazil to, of course, in the United States. Can you explain kind of how that works, right? How is it that political disinformation spreads so fast? And can anything be done about it?
Yeah, on the first point about also what can the technologists do with this power that they're slowly waking up to realizing that they have, I think the fundamental thing is, so long as their business model is exploiting the asymmetry that they know more about you than you know about yourself, they're just commercializing an asymmetry of power. That means they're using that asymmetry of power to exploit your psychology. And that's the fundamental thing that has to change. When it comes to the spread of disinformation, the study you're referencing is, there's an MIT Twitter study that fake news spreads 6 times faster than true news. Now, it's sort of obvious why that's the case. If you imagine an evolutionary landscape and there's 2 agents, and one agent is only gonna say things that are true. So you have a little robot and it's just gonna say things that are true. Not a robot, a person. And the person, to do that, they have to think, well, what's the right thing to say? What's the right grammar to say it? What words are actually accurate? They're constraining the space of things that they can and cannot say. Now imagine an other agent that they're not constraining what they say. They're gonna split test 66,000 variations of every word. They're gonna try different images. They're gonna try different colors on buttons. They're gonna actually try combinatorics on different language. Which one of those is gonna win? The unconstrained actor. It's like, imagine a martial arts fight where 2 people are about to get into a wrestling match and one person pulls out a knife and just stabs the other guy. The unconstrained actor wins. So what's really going on when I think about political disinformation, and that's just a truth, by the way. I mean, you can't argue, that's just an evolutionary fact. So what I think is going on with political disinformation is, we're expecting in this world to expect the kind of social norms that we've grown up with, that people mostly share things that are accurate. They mostly contribute in ways that are positive and beneficial. And we're not just trying to break laws or manipulate the system. And then when you move up into the virtual world, you expect those same things. You expect most people to be legitimate voices. You expect them to be real people. And that's just not the case. So our trust is miscalibrated. And the bad guys basically outcompete the good guys. And that's what we have to stop. The best predictor of whether you'll believe in a new conspiracy theory is whether you already believe in one conspiracy theory, as one example. And YouTube recommended 15 billion times the Alex Jones conspiracy theory, his videos. So do you know Alex Jones is the InfoWars? It's this, Sandy Hook, they're all crisis actors, the kids, et cetera. So if you imagine 15 billion times, that's more than the combined traffic of the New York Times, Washington Post, Guardian, BBC, Fox News combined. So this is a really, really bad situation.
What can we do about it? Is there a set of global norms that you can envision to rein in the spread of disinformation, political disinformation? Or is that just a fool's errand? Are we, as Yuval says, simply built to be more receptive to fiction?
One quick thing.
Well, both of you to weigh in.
So there's just all this science about how our minds work. There's something called the illusory truth effect, that the more something is repeated to you, the more you just believe it's true if you ask them later. So that's why if I say 9/11 Iraq, 9/11 Iraq, 9/11 Iraq, and I just put those two words together in one sentence, your mind, just that comes to you later as those two things are associated. And so I think the real thing we're reckoning with is the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of our mind. To me, this is like a new era of human history where we're holding up a mirror and seeing the authentic way that our minds are actually vulnerable. And we have to deal with that. There's a saying by my friend René Resta, who's one of the two teams given access to the full Russia 2016 data set, that if you can make it trend, you can make it true. So on Twitter, if you get the topic to be trending, you just put the media into a double bind. Let's say it's the Parkland crisis actors, or hashtag Parkland crisis actors, right? Once you do that, the media is put into a double bind. Either they say, oh, that's not true, we know that's a conspiracy, so we'll pull it down, in which case those people who believe it will accuse them of the liberal media is doing this conspiracy theory, or they keep it up and they spread a false thing. And so I think the real thing we have to recognize is that we're all prone to this. We're all vulnerable to this. I think all of us in this room, how many of you have later found like a friend of yours who posted an article about, let's say, climate change, but it was actually from like 2 or 3 years ago, but they posted as if it had just happened, right? Happens to everybody. And so these are little shortcuts where what technology makers can do is actually give us the kind of signals so an error or mistake like that doesn't happen as often by, let's say, making really salient the published date on an article. If they did that, they're letting us make better self-corrections. I think the fallacy is that it's not up to the technology companies to build super AIs like sitting from this overlooking tower with a big machine gun shooting down the fake news as it's coming in, because they can't do that. Facebook shut down 2.2 billion fake accounts in a 3-month period. I'll say that one more time. Facebook has 2.7 billion real users, and they shut down 2.2 billion fake accounts. I'm sure they got all of them, right? They can't get all of them. And so in general, we have to actually build more like a cultural immune system, so we're all aware of this. That's why last night I was at Ukraine House speaking, and in countries like Ukraine or Estonia or places where they're right next to and adjacent to different manipulation countries, they know how to be much more skeptical. And it's not just of the fakeness of the news, it's about frame control, emotional conjugation, things like that.
I want to come back to that, but I just want to clarify, do you mean that there is no engineering solution to reining in, stanching the spread of political disinformation? That it's really about rewiring our minds as individuals?
When I say that, I don't mean to say that the companies aren't responsible for the havoc that they have unleashed on the world. I believe that they're responsible for that. I don't think, though, that they have an ability. There's no capacity. There's no magic algorithm that knows how to tell what's true or false. They only know what people click. Because of that, we're left to this decision where, I'll give you an example, voter suppression. This is coming up with an election year. So most people think voter suppression is foreign actors. Turns out that most voter suppression is actually domestic voter suppression, okay? And if I'm trying to do voter suppression, you might think, well, it's someone saying the voting day is this other day, or don't vote. But what if I just say, the lines are really long? Like, is that not true? It's not a fact-checking problem. It's a frame control, suggestion, surround sound, subtle influence problem. And I think that's why we have to have a mass inoculation campaign. I can talk more about that, but I want to let you all speak.
So I'll say 2 things. First, that fake news and disinformation are not something new. They have been with us throughout history, and I think actually that it was much worse before. If you look at the earlier part of the 20th century, then at that time, countries like the Soviet Union hid the death of millions, tens of millions of people, and the rest of the world didn't really know about it. And if people reported it, no, this is fake news. There is no man-made famine in Ukraine. And today, you can't hide the death of millions of people like was done in the early part of the 20th century. You go back even more, say, the invention of print. People think, oh, print was wonderful. Finally, people could read about Galileo and Newton and whatever. You know what the bestseller was in 16th century Europe? It was manuals for hunting witches. You know, the one book, the Hammer of the Witches, which told you how to identify witches and what to do with them. It was a huge, huge bestseller. Conspiracy theories.
Until we taught women how to read. Until we taught women how to read, at which time it probably didn't sell as well.
Yeah, and this was much, much bigger than Galileo. So fake news isn't a new problem, which doesn't mean we should forget about it. It's just we need to historical perspective on that. What is new, and what is completely new, is the ability to tailor the fake news to the individual person. I mean, with the manual for hunting witches, you can't tailor it to each and every person. But with fake news today, you can tailor it. You get to know, the algorithm gets to know you personally. And very often, the people who spread these things, they are really interested in destroying the public sphere and the basis for democracy. They don't want to push a particular story. They just want to ruin the very fabric of society and the ability to have a reasoned discussion. So they would find out, say, that I already have maybe a bias against immigrants. And they would show me a fake news story about a gang of immigrants raping local women. And then they also hack you, and they discover you don't have any bias against immigrants, you actually have a bias against right-wing people. So they would show you a completely different fake news story about a gang of neo-Nazis murdering immigrants. And you would easily believe that because you already have this bias. And then I meet you in the elevator of our common apartment building, and we can't have any way of having a reasoned discussion about immigration. So this is something new.
That's new.
The ability to hack human beings and then tailor the fake news to individual people. When Hitler gave a speech on the German radio, he gave one speech to everybody. But today, you can have very different speeches. So the really new thing is this ability to hack humans, which means the ability to know people better than they know themselves. When you look from the grand historical perspective, the whole of human history, I think there is a line in the sand, a watershed, which completely changes politics, society, everything, which is the moment when an external system can know people better than they know themselves on a level of the society, not one or two persons, but everybody.
You have this very stark image that I recall of a hand reaching inside our heads. There is a notion, and I think it's a notion that we learn from every major world religion, that we know ourselves, that we should know ourselves. There's a notion that's critical to liberal democracy, that we make our own choices, right? Liberal with a small L, right? But when a company, when big data knows us better, as you're saying, does that fundamentally compromise, undermine the idea of liberal democracy?
Yes.
Has big data hacked liberal democracy?
Yeah, I mean, democracy is based on the idea that the voter knows best. If somebody knows better than the voter, can predict and manipulate the desires of the voter, that's the end of democracy as we've known it. And it's the same with the free market capitalism. It's based on the idea that the customer is always right. But what happens when somebody knows the customer well enough to predict and manipulate the wishes of the customer, then that's the end of the free market as we've known it. And we are very, very close to this point. Maybe we've passed it in some areas. And the easiest people to manipulate are those who believe in free will, are those who believe that they can't be manipulated. Because again, this manipulation it plays on your pre-existing biases. This is why you can call it hacking. You know, the way you hack a computer program is you find weaknesses already existing in the program. It's the same with the humans. You want to hack a human being, you find the pre-existing fears, hatreds, and you build on that. And that is now possible to be done on a level of entire societies. And to survive, democracy and the free market will have to reinvent themselves. And you're just falling back on wishful thinking, on liberal mythology, that no, humans are these mysterious souls, nobody can ever understand the deep secrets of the human soul. That's it, you know, until today, okay, you believe in it, it causes no harm. Now it's really dangerous, because these are the easiest people to manipulate, are those who believe that they are unhackable.
You said that in some areas that line has been crossed. I just want to ask you that, and then I want to return to, you've both got this incredible diagnosis, but I want some treatments, man. So first, in what areas, what sectors have we crossed that line?
We totally crossed the line. So also for background, and I apologize for those who know this already, but I was a magician as a kid, and so my entire worldview is framed by the hackability of the human mind. And then I studied at a lab at Stanford called the Stanford Persuasive Technology Lab with the founders of Instagram. And so the reason that we've had this frame all along is the technology that surrounds us every day is designed to influence your behavior. The simple example is just even to get you to spend more time and attention. So the easiest example of showing that the line has been crossed, I'll say one thing first. There's a bug in the Silicon Valley philosophical operating system, which is the inability to distinguish what we want from what we can't help but look at. According to Silicon Valley, if you're driving down a highway and you see a car crash and your eyes go over there, Silicon Valley says, oh, you must want car crashes. And so suddenly your life gets surrounded by car crashes because it cannot distinguish your values from your vulnerabilities. It can't distinguish that. That's the core philosophical bug. There's still a longer story there. So an example of where we've crossed this line, though, is anytime you've been on YouTube and you say, I'm going to watch this one video, and then I'm done, because I got to go back to work, right? Someone sends you a video, you're going to click on it, you say, okay, I know those other times I get sucked into a rabbit hole for a couple hours, but this time is going to be different. And then, of course, you get sucked in for 2 hours, and you say, I should have had more self-control. Because there you are, YouTube's just a library sitting there waiting to be used. Why did you get sucked in? It's your responsibility. And the fact that you think it's your responsibility is the result of a successful persuasive interaction, where when you hit play on the YouTube video, YouTube's trying to figure out how to calculate the perfect next thing to show you. So imagine that in a server inside of a Google server farm underwater with a huge supercomputing farm, it wakes up this like avatar voodoo doll version of you. And the voodoo doll is built as a model on all the past clicks you've ever made, all the likes you've ever had, all the watch time, and it makes the voodoo doll look and act a little bit more like you. So it adds hair, clothing, etc. So the point is, once the voodoo doll is very accurate, I can prick you with a video. And I can actually estimate and make a prediction that you're going to stay here for an hour and 20 minutes if I send you down the flat earth conspiracy theory world. Or you're going to stay here for 30 minutes if I show you plane crashes. Or you're going to stay here for 5 minutes if I show you the news from the BBC. So the news from the BBC is not really such a great option. So we have already jacked, basically the largest supercomputers in the world are pointed at your brain, playing chess against your mind and seeing 1 billion steps ahead on the chessboard. And that asymmetry, we crossed a long time ago, and we're not even talking about it. The simplest example of this is how many people here have felt or believe that Facebook is listening to your microphone because you were just talking with a friend about something, and then you go to Facebook and there's an ad for the thing you were just talking about. So raise your hands. How many people think? Okay, so I want you to look around. There's like at least 60% of people who raise their hands. I happen to know the actually now former senior vice president of advertising at Facebook, who has assured me, and also the external data forensics show, they don't do this. They don't listen to the microphone. What's that? You believe him. So, yes. So this is from something called the Baader-Meinhof effect, that we perceive that if two things happen around the same time, they must be linked. There's a coincidence. So how is it, though, that they are able to make that prediction? Well, the truth is it's even more scary that they're listening on the microphone is that they don't have to, because what they do is they wake up your little avatar voodoo doll, and then they just make predictions about what kinds of things you would be talking about, and the kinds of things you'd be talking about are so predictable that we actually already know what you were talking about. That's the scary
I'm not
point.
going to dare to predict your questions. I know you're not predictable. I know you're thinking of fantastic questions to ask. But before I open it up to the audience, I want to go back to diagnosis. Yes, very compelling diagnosis. But are there any treatments, regulatory or otherwise?
Yeah, there are a couple of things we can do on the individual level and the collective level. Very quickly, on the individual level, you need to get to know yourself as well as possible to stay a little ahead of them, whoever they are, the governments, the corporations. So, you know, there are different methods for different people. I do meditation, somebody goes to therapy, somebody goes hiking in the mountains for 2 weeks. It gets them to know themselves better. Whatever works for you, do it, and invest time and effort in it. Because it's really a race. Who knows you better? The moment that some corporation or government knows you better than you know yourself, that's game over. So the first thing you can do is run a bit faster in getting to know yourself. But that's not going to help in the long run. In the long run, we need to take also collective action to cover just very quickly a few things in the people who are doing it. The engineers, the technicians, they, as part of every course of studies, they should learn ethics. They should realize we are coding, we don't code computers, we are coding human lives. We are coding society, we are building a new kind of society. We can't learn just coding. You have to learn as an integral, not as an afterthought, as an integral part of your studies, ethics, sociology, philosophy, it should be there. We need regulation, government regulation.
Such as?
This should be who owns the data about me. And this should be a #1 political priority. And I'm appalled every time there is an election somewhere around the world. It's not even, you know, discussed between the.
So the question of who owns my individual data,
all my
data should be, in your view, the #1 political question.
Yes, I mean, like in previous eras, we had huge political discussion who should own land, and huge political discussion who should own the factories, the machineries. Now the big question is who owns the data, my data. We don't have good models yet. We need to start the discussion and do it very quickly. And one last point, we can design very different kinds of technologies. At present, we have some of the best minds in the world designing AI tools and surveillance tools that survey individuals in the service of corporations and governments. The people working on that, they can start designing tools that survey corporations and governments in the service of individuals. They like surveillance so much, why not design some tools that survey the government to discover government corruption? It can be done, so it's really, we still have a lot of choice. We need to exercise it before it's too late.
I'm going to put on my skeptical hat for a second. You know, no working mother I know can take 2 weeks to walk in the woods. Mm-hmm. But every working mother I know should have that ability to inoculate ourselves against, you know, hacking humanity. Similarly, when you expect engineers to be trained in ethics, right? They've got a business model and an imperative that they have to meet when they get to work. So I guess I'm looking for an answer on beyond individual responsibility.
Yeah, that's the responsibility of institutions and of governments. Institutions like universities, like doctors, they have built into their studies some ethical instructions as well. So it should be the same for computer engineers. And this is the ultimate responsibility of governments. You know, we've been there before so many times. Like you go back to the 19th century, to Charles Dickens and the coal mines, and you have all these business moguls saying, yes, but our business model is to have 8-year-old kids go to the mine to dig for coal. And if we don't do it, the Germans will eat us alive. And eventually, no, the government stepped in and said, no, you can't send. You should send them to school,
Yeah.
not to the coal mine. And looking back, people said, yes, this was actually a good idea because then we had a much smarter workforce and we could do lots of news. So this is a no-brainer now. But if we had Davos in 1880, so you had all these big companies explaining that, no, we must have the kids in the coal mine.
Right. Tristan, treatment.
Yeah. So the first thing is I also want to say that while Yuval's right about the sort of data point, increasingly, so as a computer scientist, you can make better and better predictions and then ultimately throw away the data. I'll give you an example. So Cambridge Analytica, we have Brittany Kaiser here from Cambridge Analytica. So what did Cambridge Analytica do? They had access to your personal data. They also used that to get your big 5 personality traits, your levels of ocean, your openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So that's your personality. That's sort of like below the brainstem. We know something about your weaknesses and personality that you may not know about yourself. So in the future, let's prevent that data from getting abused. Here's the problem. There's new evidence showing that just by looking at people's click patterns alone, so just the way you click around on a computer and the time delays between your clicks, you can actually predict people's big 5 personality traits with 80% accuracy. So it's the end of the poker face. I actually know you better than you know yourself just by looking at how you walk and talk, etc. I'm not saying that's true of everything, but if you imagine the compute power continuing to go up like this, the levels of predictions we can make about you, even if we don't have data, or we can throw away the data in the future, are still going to grow. So what that sets up is the real problem, and I always talk about it this way, is there's an asymmetry of power, where the technology has an asymmetric access to all of your vulnerabilities. They can control the outcomes of your biases, beliefs, etc. When we have an asymmetry of power, we have a name for that relationship to make sure it's not predatory or extractive, and it's a fiduciary relationship. If you compare the level of asymmetry between a doctor and a patient sitting there, they have to submit themselves to the operating table, they go unconscious, you're sitting there unconscious. You have to trust the doctor is there to help you. They're not going to be like, oh, great, now he's out. We're going to just, mine his liver and we're going to just predatorily extract everything we can from that asymmetric, vulnerable relationship. Imagine a psychotherapist and their client. They're revealing all the intimate details of their psyche. They can't have an extractive relationship that says, I have to commercially profit off of every single thing I could tell you to do that.
So as one solution
is to apply fiduciary law to where it actually already applies. If you compare how much information does Facebook have about you compared to a psychotherapist, I would argue in these other areas where we already apply fiduciary law, it's actually way more. So just based on the strict comparison between how much a lawyer knows more about the law versus their client, how much a doctor knows more than their patient, a psychotherapist versus their patient, they know more, so let's apply fiduciary law. What that does is it instantly kills the business model, because you can't have a doctor who's simultaneously operating on your interest and maximizing shareholder profits. So that's the uncomfortable recognition of where we are and what we have to change.
Yeah. The mics are going around. Could you please make sure that your question ends in a question mark? And please keep it short. Thank you. We'll take 3 questions. Mike, back there.
Hello. Hi, I'm Steffi Czerny from DLD. Tristan, I have a question for you. You mentioned the cultural immune system. What is it for you?
Okay, what is the cultural immune system? There was a question on this side, I believe. Here? Yes.
Hi, I'm with the Harvard Business Review from France. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the individual accountability. You talked about, Tristan, you talked about the inoculation, but from the behavior that you described, it seems like we're dealing more with like a tech addiction, which means like I wonder if the treatment to preventing it it's less about like vaccination and more about weaning people off of this drug, and if you think, what you think about that.
Okay. And one back there. Yes.
Thank you. So my question is a little bit more for Yuval than for Tristan. So from Silicon Valley's perspective, they are not responsible, and actually they're just working as a corporation, and it's just another corporation, and why should they be responsible? I mean, the best example is in the Russia investigation. They said the CIA, the NSA, any organism that are actually paid to actually do this work and stop the Russians couldn't do it, but Facebook should do it. So the question is, in all the solutions, the treatment, I mean, only regulation seems to be, kind of something that they can't avoid, and they'll try to resist it. But is there anything else? Because changing people's behavior is not going to happen. Changing their behavior is not going to happen either. And they actually have the free markets, the laws for them that nobody can compel them to change. They're not going to change. So the question is there anything else really other than regulation?
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
I'll try to give quick answers to some of the things I heard. Taking them out of order, on addiction, we have a podcast, by the way, called Your Undivided Attention, where we interview different subject matter experts, including Brittany and some other people in this room. I would love to get Yuval on. And we interviewed someone on addiction, and that the answer to addiction is not sobriety, it's connection, right? People need human connection, they need nature connection, they need connection to something. It's actually because of a lack and anxiety and emptiness that we actually get addicted to things. So imagine a world of technology that makes it so it's as easy to access time with your meaningful relationships, whether it's FaceTime calls or cooking nights or that kind of thing, as it is to access Wikipedia. Right now, social coordination is really hard. It's one of the hardest things in the world. That should be made a lot easier. That's one answer there. On the cultural immune system, there's a great book called The Democratic Surround by Professor Fred Turner at Stanford. And he writes about the way that in the 1940s in the United States, there was a group called the Committee for National Morale and the Institute for Propaganda Analysis who were concerned with how to cultivate what they called the democratic personality in the United States. They didn't see the democratic personality or the democratic mindset as something that came for free. It had to be actively cultivated. And I think we need that kind of cultivation. So instead of free will, we need cultivated will. Yes, there's no free will, but we can cultivate more and more volition, values-based thinking, open-mindedness, et cetera. And that actually successfully happened in the 1940s because we were worried about the threat of fascist propaganda reaching our population, actually because we were so concerned about how fast Germany, like the pinnacle of philosophy and contemporary values, could fall into Nazism. How could that happen? So it was in reaction to, oh my God, the mind works very differently than we thought, that we have to cultivate some different strong thing. And then what was the last question about regulation? Just really quick before Yuval answers is internal employees. We have found that using the pressure of the own employees waking up and saying, oh my God, I didn't know what was going on here. I want to help from the inside. This is what our nonprofit focuses on full time, is getting the internal employees because that's much faster acting. And if you have to pay 3 times more to hire people because they're disenchanted from working there, if you have college campuses who don't want to get hired there, if you have people leaving and you have to retain them, it's a serious economic value.
Some people would call that union organizing.
Engineers of the world unite. I think that going really deeply, I mean, the real answers ultimately are from the realm of philosophy and politics. That we can have all kinds of patches to help us get through this particular crisis. But in a very deep sense, I think what we are seeing is really a fundamental challenge to the humanistic worldview which dominated the world, certainly the Western world, for 2 or 3 centuries. And really the basic assumptions of this worldview are crumbling about individuality, about individual agency, about free will. They are really crumbling, not because of a new philosophical argument, but because of new practical technologies. And the real answers will have to come from addressing these fundamental philosophical questions. And we are not there yet. I mean, we don't know what new kind of value system or new kind of worldview will emerge. And it will have to be translated through a political process into new policies. I mean, ultimately, whatever individuals do on their own, whatever companies feel obliged to do, this is what we have politics for, to make these kinds of changes and corrections.
To that point, I am very struck, as are some of my colleagues, that at Davos this year, there isn't a whole lot of conversation about the role of technology in our political lives specifically. What do you make of that? It feels like a silence. I mean, it's not like the tech world isn't here. They're here. Palantir has a pavilion, Facebook, Amazon Web Services, everyone's here. But there is a notable elision of this particular topic in the wider conversation at Davos. I wonder if you
Yeah, it's partly that they don't know what to do with that, and partly is that the ignorance is bliss. I mean, it's much easier to continue the old political discussions than to start completely new political discussions. I mean, this is why issues like terrorism or immigration draw so much political attention. It's not because they are the most important, it's because they are kind of, we already know what kind of the views and the questions are, and there is kind of a reassuring feeling, oh, we are having this debate. I know what I think, I know what the other side is thinking. With these kinds of questions, I mean, what is the difference between Republicans and Democrats when it comes to AI regulation? I have no idea.
Tristan, do you have a thought on why we're not hearing, at least on the public stages, tech executives talking about their role, particularly in an election year?
I think zooming out for the sort of Davos cultural frame, I don't think that it's like with technology, you don't want to question whether the basic of whether technology is good at all for people. You just want to say, well, there's these bad use cases, there's these bad apples. Capitalism must be good. There's just these bad externalities of these other issues. The fundamental issue is that we have a neoliberal, unfettered market system that spits out these externalities for breakfast. And that's the thing I don't think that at Davos we want to question. That in the same way that industrial capitalism, a whale is worth more dead than alive, and a tree is worth more as lumber than as a tree, a human being in the attention model is worth more if they're addicted, distracted, outraged, polarized, and disinformed than they are if there is a human being, whether that's your kid or that's a person or a citizen in a democracy. And that's not because anyone's evil, it's just what the model prefers, in the same way that the model would prefer that someone is diabetic first and then we sell them a subscription plan. So that's what the system prefers. And I don't think that's a conversation that at Davos people want to have or admit. And one last thing on the technology point is that, you know, our concern when we talked about policy, which is so important, and this is a political discussion, is the technology issues are going to increase and accelerate much faster than governments can catch up, which is why our problem statement for our organization is, going back to E.O. Wilson, the fundamental problem of humanity is we have Paleolithic minds, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. And those operate on 3 different clock rates, because your Paleolithic brain was fixed 200,000 years ago, and that's baked, it's not changing. Your medieval institutions go update every 4 or 5 years, maybe. You get GDPR passed after 5 years. And then you have accelerating godlike technology that's creating new processes of new possibilities and risks and harm much faster. So if you think about it, we have to embrace our Paleolithic minds, upgrade our medieval institutions, and then slow down and have the wisdom to actually wield godlike technology. That's the only way.
I have a stack of questions that I haven't had a chance to ask. We're fast running out of time. Do we have 5 minutes? Yes. Yeah. So I just want to take one question from the audience, and then I want to wrap up with one last one. So very, very quickly, one question.
Thank you. Can we deploy that hacking ability towards solving an issue like climate change? It looks like our ability to save ourselves is pretty slim. How can we do about that?
This is exactly what I'm trying to get Silicon Valley to do. I think that the redemption for basically destroying democracy all around the world all at once and sending us into a dark ages is that the thing that they can do to redeem themselves is to take all of the infrastructure that they've built and help it. They've already built this global sense-making, global choice-making, global social meaning-making infrastructure. And right now, to the extent it even touches climate change, we didn't talk about this, but 50% of YouTube videos that are recommended are climate denial videos in one study. And when you're on Facebook, to the extent you deal with climate change or you have it in your feed at all, it's mostly, if it's pro-climate change, it's mostly, it's worse than you thought, and there's nothing you can do. So it basically doses people with learned helplessness at the 2.7 billion person scale. Those are not productive human experiences for dealing with climate change. And they could do a massive, imagine all the hours, if any of you do follow climate change, all the minutes and hours you've ever spent looking at climate material online. And we did a huge find and replace operation for all those minutes that you were just reading the same paragraphs and sentences you've already read thousands of times, and replaced it with actions. Or this is who you can vote for in the next election. Or here you can post your climate story about your farm that got destroyed and let other people know who deny climate change this actually happened to you. So we actually have worked on a list of about 300 things that tech companies could do if they were to actually tackle climate change, and that's what I'd love to see them do next.
I just want to make sure I understand you clearly. The finest brains of our generation are working in Silicon Valley to drive up advertising revenues, and you want them to solve climate change instead.
Eventually, they will go along in the boat down into the water with us, and whether they have more money in the graveyard isn't going to matter.
I just want to ask you very quickly, is there one part of ourselves, one part of our existence that is so precious or that is so tender that we shouldn't give it up to technology, that we shouldn't give it up to big data? Is it choosing who rules us, or how we raise our children, or who we love, or something else? Is there one aspect of life that we should just keep for ourselves?
Well, I think that generally we should use technology for our own purposes and not be used by it. And this is true for all aspects of life. I don't think that we should kind of divide life into areas. Okay, we can let technology take over these areas, but these will just get completely to ourselves. It's, you know, it's all combined. And I'm often sometimes depicted as somebody who is like against technology or hates technology. No, I think technology can do wonderful things for humans. I spent a lot of time discussing the problems because you have so many smart people explaining all the benefits. So you need some historians and philosophers to point out, look, there are also dangers. But it's not that technology is bad. Like, I met my husband online in one of the first gay dating sites that came up in 2002 in Israel. And this was a wonderful thing that technology did for me. I mean, I lived in a small provincial Israeli town, quite homophobic, no place to meet guys. And suddenly the internet comes along, and you have this virtual space that you can easily meet people. And funnily enough, he lived about 400 meters from my house in the next street. And we drove each day to school. We were in different schools, but in the same area. So we drove each day the same bus back. We never met, as far as we know, and we met in cyber, in virtual reality, in virtual space. And that's a wonderful thing that technology can do for people. So it's not about expelling technology from some special areas in our lives. It's knowing how to use technology for your purposes instead of being enslaved by it for its purposes.
Do you want to add anything, Tristan?
I think that was great. I mean, just to say, same perspective, technology by itself isn't destructive or evil. It's bad incentives running way too powerful technology. And that, just like what you've all said, I mean, that dating site back in 2001 didn't have virality growth hackers trying to maximize, you know, filters and likes and social comment. I mean, they were just basically, here's a address book. I mean, I don't know exactly which dating site it was, but in general, if you remember back to those days, when the internet is just a tool, it's a library, it's actually mostly okay. It's the active recommendation system. It's when it wants something from you. It's when it has an incentive to personalize. Those are when all these other issues show up. And so I think that the point is that culture has to be above technology. If technology goes above culture and it starts to decide what culture is, what our values are, what kids want, so you have a whole generation growing up as narcissism and how many followers you have and whether you have an Instagram account with 50,000 followers is the value. That's technology taking over, crawling down the brain stems of children and actually inserting their values into your children. That's not okay. Culture has to be above technology. That's the main thing. So.
Thank you both very much for a super interesting discussion, and thank you all for being here.